So you're not in Australia today?
I'm not. I don't know if we talked about this last time, did we?
I can't remember. But you were nearly in Australia when
I was
we were
nearly in Australia.
left last week.
I nearly was. So I had a unfortunate bereavement in the family. My
I'm
nana
very sorry to hear that. Yeah.
passed away after quite a long time. She was ill for quite a long time. So
Good innings then?
Definitely good innings. But the funeral was 2:00 in the morning, English time, UK time last night. So I watched that.
You decided not to go out there.
Not to go.
Which was on the cards as a possibility, wasn't it?
Decided not to go. So I got my visa. That was incredibly straightforward to get.
Mm-hmm.
And decided not to go. Anyway, long story short, watched it last night at 2:00 in the morning.
Wow.
And then drove to Oxford at 5:30. So a bit tired today.
You've had a long day.
But I was reflecting on the way, thinking how, isn't it, the way when you go to a funeral or you hear a funeral, you always find out things about people that you never thought to ask or never knew about when they're alive.
Yeah, you wish you'd known that when they were alive.
Yeah, and I don't know, she ran the bar at the Working Men's Club in Trench in Telford for 20 years.
She sounds like quite a formidable woman.
She was quite a formidable woman. And I think one of the things my uncle said was that the bar was 20 metres long, and at one end you had the kind of pub athletes, the beer drinkers, darts, dominoes and that. In the middle you had the spirits drinkers, they occupy the middle, and then down the far end it was the wine kind of end. But he said she was able to relate to everybody, no matter whether they were in the, which end of the bar they were at. She was able to move between social groups like that. And I thought, well, yeah, there's lots to be learned from that, isn't there, in terms of how we communicate with different people and how we relate.
Well, I'm touched by the observation as well that we find out so much about people after they've gone. You could have perhaps had an interesting discussion with her about that if only you'd known.
Exactly. So I think it's encouraged me to think we should be more proactive with the people we have around us, because you never know when they're not going to be around anymore to ask questions. So,
well, I think we should dedicate this episode then
to Nana.
To Richard's Nana. What was her name?
Lillian Ost.
Well,
Lil behind the till.
This is for Lil behind the till. Great. Well, there you go. It's a positive spin on a otherwise somber
sad
occasion.
situation. Yes.
Yeah. Good. Well, let's do a podcast on the back of that. Hello and welcome to another episode of the SME Growth Podcast from Wellmeadow, where every week we try and come up with some useful or interesting tips for people who own or manage small and medium-sized enterprises. And with me this week, as ever, is Rich.
Hello.
Needs no introduction. So we're on episode 71. We're going to have to think about when the next big milestone is to get a cake or something.
It's got to be 100, isn't it, really? Probably.
Yeah, it does seem 100 is the next big one. I was thinking 75, but I just want some cake.
Well, we haven't had a beer on the podcast for a while. I mean, that would have been a fitting tribute to Nana.
Well, flipping it, a little behind the till.
There we go, because I don't think I've seen a photo of her without a glass of wine in her hand. So,
oh my goodness,
we should have done that, really.
Right, well, if there's a sudden jolt in the frame and we restart this episode with a beer in our hand, you know where that came from. So we're taking it a bit of a trial of starting our podcast with a little review of the previous three, in case anybody's come in on this one and wondered what they've just missed and maybe attempted to go back and see what else we've been up to. So last week we talked about managing an in-house startup using the very easy to say intrapreneurship word.
So we all learnt a new word. 7
lessons of intrapreneurship, and we reflected on some of the things we've done and some of the things our clients have done. So that was. I actually found that more interesting than I thought it was going to be there. That's good. But I say that every week.
Again, we surprised ourselves.
I know, There's always more in these things. Episode 69 was the one about Google's Performance Max, which remains an intriguing topic. I was looking at our performance again this morning.
There's a little bit of a enigma wrapped in a riddle, isn't it?
Yeah. So we shall give an episode over to that, I think, in a few weeks' time and give a bit more reflections. But yeah, lots of ways they catch you out to charge you some money for rubbish traffic, as it turns out. So anyway, we'll come back to that and see if it's been a successful round. And then the one before that, episode 68, was our first ever podcast talking about board meetings. Having done 3,000 board meetings in 20 years, we thought maybe in episode 68 we'll talk about that now.
And finally got around to it. And then off the back of that,
we've
got today's topic.
So. And I need to thank Matt, really, because I bumped into Matt yesterday, and he said, I listened to that podcast about the board meetings, and he was preparing for the board meeting that I was about to go into with him. He said, you should do one about preparing the reports for a board meeting, board reports. So this is for you, Matt. We've done it. This is today's podcast episode is about tips to prepare a board report.
And I suppose it's quite, whilst it sounds dry, we will make it as interesting as possible.
It certainly sounds
using
dry.
Our usual flair for these things. But no, it's quite an important topic, I think, because it's the document around a lot of decisions get made.
Well, I should do.
Viewed.
Yeah. I think there's two cardinal sins that get committed around board reports. One is that people spend way too long preparing for them. And when they should be doing their day job, they're spending all day worrying probably, but certainly working on a board report. And then the other one is when it's finally presented in whatever format, everyone just falls asleep sort of listening to it, and then they're waiting for that subject to be over so they can move on to the next one.
Yeah.
And to your point, no decisions are made about it at all. So you think, well, all that time has been expended for absolutely no value at all. So you should at least fix one of those things. If you're not going to make decisions, don't bother writing the thing, but I wouldn't advocate that. I'd say come up with a well thought out way of summarizing your activities of your department for the month, and then make sure that there's value in it for the people who are listening.
Yeah. I think I'm just thinking of a book. I'm staring at it right now, actually, on the bookshelf behind you. Information is Beautiful book. I think I would
recommend that to anyone who just likes art, really.
But I think having those kind of, reading a book like that where it takes a lot of data and visualizes it in different ways, not to say that you should spend a huge amount of time with, doing that if it's not your skill set or whatever. But I think it's the sort of thing that gives you ideas, inspiration. How do I communicate a message out of the numbers that I've got that is compelling and tells a story and gets my point across? Because that's what you're trying to do with a board report.
It is. You've got to. There's so many things you're trying to do at once. You're trying to be comprehensive yet concise. You're trying to be high level yet detailed. You're trying to be impactful and well thought through without spending all week writing it. So it's probably no different to the conflicts you have as a director of a company anyway, where you're trying to be entrepreneurial yet conservative, brave yet cautious, and all those things. So one thing that we try to get people used to in the board meetings that we chair and where we coach directors is try to think about your board report in 4 sections. Now, they're not all of equal size or anything like that, and also try and keep it on a 1 page if you can. But imagine a 1-page A4 board report in 4 sections. And the top section, and this is almost the hardest bit, is the headline. I'm sure there was a Churchill quote, and if it wasn't Churchill, it's been attributed to him a million times, which is where he said, "I'm sorry this report is so long, I didn't have time to write a shorter one."
Yeah.
And it kind of encapsulates the problem. Actually, to really boil down what you want to say into something that's really short is really quite difficult.
And that's why this podcast is 35 minutes long.
Well, you just wait. It'll be an hour before we're finished. And then we will need that beer. So the headline, and we used to say try and make it into a tweet, 140 characters, but I don't think that limit exists, and it's not called tweet anymore. So out of date reference. But a headline. So what's going to draw me in? And almost if there's 10 points on an agenda and I only had time to read 10 headlines, what would the headline be for your section? Sales are doing this, and operations did that, and health and safety did that, and HR said this, and marketing said that, and finance said such and such. That would in itself be a little 5-minute summary, if you like, for the whole company. That's not bad, it'd be useful. So just trying to think, what's the headline?
I think as well, maybe another point is for a lot of SMEs, perhaps quite a lot of what's going on before you go into the board meeting as well. And so there is a danger that kind of familiarity breeds contempt with these things. So that headline really should be aiming at something that is worthy of discussion. Really, it's not.
Don't be obvious.
It's not the water cooler chat type thing. It's this is what we need to really take stock of and
exactly.
Get some traction.
And that will link back to the 4th section, which we'll come to in a minute. So then sections 2 and 3 are variations on a theme. Section 2, I'd like to say, give the backward-looking bit, what's happened, and section 3 is the forward-looking bit, what's going to happen, what we've got planned. And then section 4, back to what you just said, decision-making, discussion points, whatever you want to call it. But as a result of what you've just heard, what do we now need to talk about?
Yeah.
So that's a sort of an overarching, not quite template, but format, or at least 4 things to think about when you're trying to put your report together.
Yeah. So I suppose, do we want to, we've touched on the headline, haven't we?
So you do the headline.
If we want to do
so then I think,
looking backwards, what should people be?
I've tried to use the metaphor before of the control room of a nuclear power station. It doesn't really matter. It could be the dashboard of an aeroplane or whatever your chosen metaphor is. But dashboard design is a hell of a science. It's called human factors, I think, is the part. Right. It's a subset of that science. And designing dashboards is so difficult. And this isn't about dashboard, but the metaphor is that if you were controlling something very complicated, you need to know the important things first, and you need to have the equivalent of the red flashing light alarm, which says flipping X, something's going wrong, alert. And then you need some things that take up quite a bit of time or space, and they're maybe big dials or big numbers or whatever. And then you've got a load of little like oil pressure warning lights, which are yellow and out of the way somewhere, or, that's, so imagine the car dashboard. It's a good metaphor for it. And the problem I find that a lot of companies is that they have the same template report every month, no matter whether one particular measure is crazy out of control or bang on target.
Yeah.
And you get the worst case ones where people have been very lazy or efficient, if you put it that way, where they've got almost exactly the same report word for word, and all they do is change the numbers. And it becomes so boring to read it because there's nothing of them in it. You just get used to it, So imagine you're running that nuclear power station. First thing you want to know is, are there any dead bodies anywhere? Are there any red flashing lights? Is there anything going out of control? Anything we need to, push the big red button and evacuate for? Get those out of the way first, and then maybe look at some of the other ones that are the next level down.
I think maybe a point on that as well is to make sure you've got systems in place so you can get those backward-looking numbers pretty quickly, because sometimes you go places where they haven't got the accounts ready for ages after the month end, and it's almost, we're talking about something now that is almost 2, maybe 3 months ago. There's nothing we can do about it anyway, but also if there's a problem, we're not identifying it quickly and able to react and do anything with it. So having those kind of the systems in place to collect those metrics efficiently is a. And
maybe have some little rules in place across all the various things that you measure or monitor. And this is, you've said before that I've got an engineering background, and this is a lesson learned from a discipline in engineering called statistical process control, SPC. And they say that for numbers that are reasonably random and bounce around their mean or their target, whatever, set the alarm if you get a certain number of them in a row above or below where they should be, or a certain number of them in a row trending in the same direction. And in SPC, you might choose 7 or something, but maybe for a business of your complexity, it might be 3 or 4 or something. But if you have 3 months in the trot where you're below target, or 3 months, 4 months in the trot where it's going in the same direction, maybe that is your internal rule to say, right, that needs discussing this month. Yeah. We've got ourselves a trend here or something outside the norm. Yeah. So come up with some sort of rule that works out what are the key things you open up with, and try and make it different every time. Well, if it's the same problem every time, then don't. But don't slavishly just say, I'm always going to talk about, sales first and margin next, or I'm always going to talk about leads generated first and then orders received next, or, do it in order of what's important to know about first, and work on the basis that your audience is probably going to start losing interest after 30 seconds and certainly after a couple of minutes. You get them while they're fresh, You take the stage, you've got to say something, catch their attention.
And then one thing for each section, it's not quite an executive summary, but oftentimes would be like, right, what are the 3 bullet points? So that backwards looking bit will have the data in it, but then you're trying to pull out those points so that somebody can scan that section and just bullet points there. They almost don't need your commentary over it. That's not to say that doesn't invalidate the commentary, but you're giving almost that executive summary for that section. Yeah,
so imagine if you had a graph and there's some sort of, it's away from target or there's a trend or something, have just it's almost like a subheading, isn't it? You've had the headline of the whole report. What's the headline for this measure or this graph? Does it matter? I've chosen to put it up the top, so it must matter. Why does it matter? Yeah. This is a problem because in 3 months' time, this is going to happen, or this is the consequence of something that happened 3 months ago, and it's because, Mary left and she had the keys to the filing cabinet, or we lost that big deal because we had reputational damage, or whatever. You've got to give it that context. But as you say, an executive summary of each point you're trying to make, really trying to fine-tune your message. It's quite a craft, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I think it also shows that you understand what's going on. If you can be concise and craft the message well, And unless you understand what's going on, how are you going to fix it?
Exactly.
So,
and you're right. This is a good demonstration that you're in control. I've got this area. Everybody, don't worry. This is it. However, this is what I want to tell you.
Yeah.
So I think, that's an important point. And I think the other one that it sort of aligns to pick the most important things first. Don't drill down into a morass of detail underneath every single measure. So if your order intake, for example, we're picking on sales guys again, if that's above target, don't spend ages then working about, which sales guy is above and which guy is below. As a team, you've achieved it. You're going to have some management issues you're dealing with behind the scenes, but you don't have to go into it. Now, if you're below, we might start working out, is this a trend? Have we got any problems here that have been lasting a while that we need to deal with? But don't go right down into they haven't got the orders in. And if I look at their number of meetings, that's been low. And if I look at the number, it's going too detailed too soon.
When you probably want to go into the meeting with that knowledge anyway, don't you? So that's not a kind of thing that, kind of get onto one of the things here about, being prepared for questions.
Yeah.
But, having the answers quickly and concisely is going to help you get through that report a lot easier.
Yeah, but you're demonstrating that you understand it.
Yeah.
And maybe this is where people get caught out because they come to a board meeting not having properly reviewed things regularly in between times, and they really are just preparing this for the board meeting.
Yeah.
Well, you shouldn't really ever have to prepare something just for the board meeting. It should have use or exist outside of the board meeting, right?
And you've got to have that. You just got to put the time aside, I think, to go through it. I mean, I used to put figures together for a company, and it was a bit of a pain to do it, but it meant that I knew exactly, almost I could remember 3 months ago what a certain person had done or not done or whatever, and it just gave you that context. And I think you've got to know your numbers.
Yeah. Well, I remember you telling me about that, and we both have had that role at various companies. I was doing one only this morning where I prepare their management reports at a high level for them. But you told me once that when you automated it, you didn't automate it, you delegated it. I remember the chap who you gave it to, and you lost that sense, that immediate sense of what was going on.
Yeah, so I took it back in the end, even though, and it only took me maybe an hour or so to do it, but it just by putting the numbers into the spreadsheet meant that I kind of just remembered and I got a feel for who was up, who was down, where was the issue. You can then construct the story around it. I was doing that this morning with someone, and again, this is kind of how you tell that story is actually quite important, because you're going to have a load of numbers, a load of different things that happen over time. Being able to construct the narrative to say, this is why we are where we are today, because of these things, and this happened here, and this happened here, and this is why we lost 100 grand here, and this and this and this.
You just got to know it. You've got to know your numbers.
You've got to know it, and you've got to know the context as well. Know the numbers, know the context, and be able to craft that story. And that actually helped everybody in the room to really get a grip on, it's not panic. We don't have to panic here. There's a rational explanation for what's happened, and actually going forward now we understand it. We've got a better grasp on the situation. And that kind of, I suppose, leads you almost into the next section of the report, which is the forward-looking bit, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's like anything, like the medical metaphor. You've got to have a good diagnosis first before you can then decide what the treatment's going to be. So unless you've properly understood it and you've satisfied yourself, you have understood why something has happened. Yeah. There's no point rushing into that debate about what happens next.
What happens next, yeah.
And you mentioned context there as well, and I think that's true in the broader strategic sense. Where are we going with the company, and does this matter? But the other more detailed meaning of context is, you see it quite often in people's reports where they just give you the number, the bold number. This is the rate of this, the rate of accidents, let's say, or the efficiency on the shop floor, or whatever. And maybe with a historical trend. But unless you've given it against a target, against last year's number, against your forecast, or maybe all of those things, then how is anybody supposed to interpret that? Yeah. They're not as close to your department as you are. So saying, we were up at efficiency of 75% this month, well, is that good? Are we usually at 90% or are we normally at 50%? And what did we say it was going to be? You've just recruited 10 people to improve the area, or you've invested £1 million to get that up, and it has or hasn't happened. So context in that sense as well. What should it be? Give me a bit of a clue here, if I'm reading this report.
Yeah, I think context. And there's a good book, I can't remember who wrote it now, but it's called Narrative Leadership. And it's all about how you tell the story. And I think I think I'm halfway through it at the moment. It's one of those slow burner ones, but it's definitely worth people who have got to write board reports and convince people of their numbers and convince themselves of what's going on, to have that narrative, have that context, have that diagnostic of what's going on, to really, you can convey a huge amount of information very efficiently if you've got that.
Yeah. And whilst the written report may well be quite comprehensive, but hopefully circulated beforehand and people have been able to read it for themselves and understand it, I think when you come to present it, you don't want to fall into that trap that we call reading bedtime stories. I think we mentioned this in our board meeting podcast. I don't want to be read to. I can read it myself.
Yeah.
Now, is it Jeff Bezos that starts all his board meetings with that half an hour bit of silence where everybody reads all the reports? You know, if that's your style, fair enough. But I'd rather that people read it in their own time at a time that suits them, rather than us all sitting around while everybody has to digest it for the first time. You probably owe it to your colleagues to prepare a bit for the meeting, just work out what's coming. So I get that, but you called it there the narrative. I think telling a story with the numbers is the key point. You're gathering around the campfire of the board table, the metaphorical campfire, and you're saying, this is how it's going, everybody. I've had a good month, bad month. This is what's happened as a result of things I've done before. This is a new thing that's happened. This is what we need to talk about. And you take people on a bit of a journey. And that's much more engaging, isn't it? They talk about that with public speaking.
Maybe it's straying into a separate podcast topic, but if you've got a good amount of psychological safety within your board as well, or good relationships, it's much easier to have those more difficult conversations or say, this is what's going wrong. Oftentimes, if you've got a dominant character on the board, people can back off talking about bad news, or all you hear is the good news, or you only hear one version of events, and that can lead to. A good point.
I would say you have to have. I was going to just say you need to include the good news and the bad news. You're right, but you're absolutely correct. You need that safe space to do that in. And I guess you're referring to the Paciolini 5 dysfunctions of a team type theory, and the base level there is trust. Unless you've got trust, you can't challenge each other, and you won't set aggressive goals and all that sort of thing. So you've got to have the right environment, and that comes from the leader, whoever, and the leadership team. But you've got to allow for sensible discussion when someone admits there's been a failure in their area, rather than all piling on and thinking, thank goodness that's not me getting the spotlight this month. Someone else has had it in the neck.
And I think that does link. Yeah, we've talked about vision before on the podcast. We've talked about strategy and strategic goals. If you've got that alignment across the whole board, that we've got a very clear vision that we're aiming at, we've got very clear strategic goals. And it's not kind of like, well, sales have got to do this thing on their own in isolation, and marketing are doing this, and ops are doing this. And if everyone's trying to work together, I think it then becomes a lot easier then to have those conversations about what's going right, what's going wrong. You don't have that kind of siloed mentality of, well, you lot are rubbish, we're doing really well.
It's not the team competitiveness. You're not trying to say my department's better than your department. It's like saying, I'm a better goalkeeper than you are a striker. We're all just trying to do the same thing, get the ball in the flipping net out the other end. And so we've all got to accept that some people will make mistakes, or even it may not be, almost certainly not your fault, if you want to be really precise about it. But as long as you come to the board saying, I've got our back on this, everybody, it is in my patch. I didn't cause it. Maybe it was a customer did something crazy, or a supplier let you down, or an employee left, or it doesn't matter. But for you to come and give that confidence to the board, say, right, this has happened, this is what's going wrong with the numbers. Can I just forewarn you downstream somewhere that operations, you're going to have no work next month and all this, but I'm dealing with my bit. I'm now asking you to deal with your bit, even if I've triggered it. Just
own it.
Own it, yeah.
Own the outcome.
Own the
outcome.
That once for somebody. You did coin that once for somebody. I remember who that somebody was.
I do remember a story. It was a brief anecdote on this of the Steve Jobs biography, which is quite an interesting read. And I think in that they were talking. There was something going wrong with the glass on the Apple iPhone, the original one. Yeah. And they were talking about whoever was responsible for the glass was talking about, well, we've got these problems in China with the supplier, and it had to be some special thing. And he currently sat there, and then Steve Jobs just turned to him and said, well, why are you still in this meeting? And he just thought, what do you mean? Like, you need to be on a plane now. Go and fix it. Yeah. And I just thought, that's amazing. Just kind of how many people would do that.
That's focus, right?
You just be like, right.
That's a good point. We'll come back on meetings generally, but a lot of times people are there for the wrong reasons.
Yeah.
Remember the first time you saw an iPhone? I think we might have been together, unless you saw another one. I think it was at a client in Telford, where we did a lot of work on the shop floor. Oh, yeah. And the quality guy came in. I think his name was Chris.
Yeah.
And he showed me this thing. And we'd all seen about it on the telly, and he showed me. And I remember thinking, what's the point of having an iPod that you can make phone calls on? It just seems such a crazy idea.
I know. It's like Star Trek now, isn't it?
It is.
We are living in the future.
So we talked about make sure you include the bad news as well as the good news in a trust environment.
Yeah.
I think highlighting the risks as well. The fact that something hasn't gone wrong yet doesn't mean that it will never go wrong. So just reporting historically on what's happened isn't really the whole picture.
Yeah.
And everyone's used to the idea of risk assessments from a health and safety point of view. And we've maybe talked about risk registers once or twice for the board as a whole. And I think the board certainly that we work on are used to the fact that we insist a risk register is kept and we review it regularly and mitigations are taken and so on. But that's as valid in your department as it is for the company as a whole.
Yeah.
So what succession planning gaps have you got? What vulnerabilities have you got to particular suppliers or something upstream or whatever? Let's get together with your team. It'd be interesting and say, in an Armageddon scenario, what are the sorts of things that might go wrong? What chances are there of it going wrong? And what can we do to mitigate it?
I think it's one of those things that sounds quite boring. But actually, when you engage people with it and you do the exercise of going through a risk register at any level, company level or departmental, when you actually start going into it, it does actually throw up a huge amount of strategic stuff. Yeah. Because it's not the stuff that's happening every day, because that gets dealt with. It's the things that actually we've got to do a bit of horizon scanning here, environment scanning. Yeah. What are the things that could go wrong? How can we mitigate for them now? All of those sorts of things. Yeah. What's in our control? What's not in our control? So I'm going
to give a shout out to Matt's company, Matt, who inspired the subject for today, because they do roving health and safety sort of mini audits all the time. Started off around the different departments of the company, but because their teams often go out to client sites, they're also visiting client sites and doing it as well, which is adding value to the clients. Yeah. And you think, well, that's pretty good. You're trying to go and look for risks. It's the same with these companies that are very good at identifying near misses rather than just reporting accidents. But back to our theme of writing the board report, don't feel you have to give us results of your risk assessments or whatever they are every month. Yeah. It's going to be as dry as ditch water. Yeah. Tell us when something has changed. If a new risk has cropped up or you had a success with something that's reduced the risk, that's newsworthy. But don't just tell us, we've still got a problem because Betty knows everything and she's nearing retirement. We knew that last month. What's happened? What's different?
Yeah, it's back to that process control thing, isn't it? It's where's the variance?
Yeah.
So we talked about that's quite a lot of backward looking. Yeah. What about the forward looking?
Yeah, and you get that a lot. I suppose accounts are the worst at that because that's like, what do they call it? Running a business by the accounts is like driving a car with a rear view mirror. Right. Just looking through the rear view mirror. You just can't do it. You need to look ahead. And it's hard, certainly an accounts people, but salespeople as well, don't like committing themselves to a forecast because the one thing we all know is going to be wrong. It will never be right.
Exactly.
All forecasts are wrong. But you've got to have some attempt at saying, okay, that's where we've gone to. What's the next month got in store? Yeah. So certainly for your measures, try and come up with some sort of forecast, but also for your activities. Imagine you're in the place of now writing next month's board report. What sort of things am I likely to have to talk about? What would I like to be talking about? Wouldn't it be nice to say we've cracked that problem or we've improved this measure or whatever it might be? So a little bit of Imagineering, a bit of thinking ahead.
I suppose aligning that to strategic projects as well, isn't it? So I'm thinking a lot about strategic projects recently and developing some of the tools we've got. And it's one of those where how much time do you put aside to think about your strategic projects? Everybody's busy. We've talked before about directors in SMEs typically having at least 2, maybe 3 or 4 different hats, with the director hat on saying, we've got to think about the future. We've got to think about what's coming up. What are the strategic projects with that 3-month, 6-month time frame? How much time are we putting into that in terms of, what are we doing looking forward? Those sorts of things. Yeah. It's important to carve out that time, and because then you've got something to write about looking forward, haven't you?
So. Yeah, and not just that bit we said in episode 68 where we talked about the board meeting structure, and you had a bit of forward-looking strategic stuff at the end. Even in your reporting section, the middle bit of the board meeting, where you are looking backwards mostly, think strategically what aligns to what here. How are we prioritizing? Yeah. And how am I making sure I'm not drowning in just doing all the things that people have had ideas that would be a good idea, rather than saying, hang on, this is the one thing that matters, or these are the things that matter.
Well, I had a good example of that today, to be honest, where I was in a board meeting and we were talking about cash flow, and we had previously been to a daily cash flow just because that was what was needed at the time. It had disappeared off the radar for a while because things were okay. And then today we thought, well, hang on a minute. The level of control that we had when we had that forward-looking view at a very, very granular level was actually quite useful. Yeah. And it actually drove a huge amount of change in the business. And things have just started to not go off the boil, but We're not seeing the rate of improvement that we were when we had that. So I said, right, okay, let's now, looking forward, put that in for 3 months just on the daily cash flow. Internal person manages.
And surely you don't need daily cash flow forecast if you're awash with cash.
Exactly.
But when you're getting close to the wire, it is almost essential, isn't it, to avoid going bust. And I think that's probably a fair point, that when the temperature goes up and you're getting closer to a crisis, then you shorten your vision and tighten the grip. You've got to change the way. You're not trying to run for 10 years' time when you're trying to survive another month. You talked before about preparing for questions. And I think that partly comes hand in hand with getting the others in your department to check what you're writing and help write the report with you, but not in the way that people hearing that might think. I'm not saying you'll get round in a room and say, let's write this month's board report. Yeah. But imagine if once a week you did get together and say, let's have a department meeting. And even if it's a 10-minute stand-up on a Monday morning or a Friday afternoon, what's this week got in store? How's this week gone? If you did do that once every week, you would capture enough little snippets that then when you come to write the board report, it almost writes itself, because it's those headlines as the month has gone by. Yeah. And I suppose if you've done that, you can then go back to your team members and say, right, I'm preparing the board report. What would anybody want to make sure I cover this month? Any particular decisions you think we need to take? Any heroes we need to praise? Any problems we need to shout out about? And that, highlight those sort of things.
Share the ownership.
Share it, yeah. But then that leads to the prepare for the questions bit that you talked about. If you've got a lot more detail in your head, you don't have to present it all. But then when someone asks a question,
just recall, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. It keeps it present as well, then, doesn't it? It's not the sort of, it's a bit like a strategic report, isn't it? It's people, that whole kind of lament, let's do a strategic report or review, and it sits gathering dust in a cupboard for a year.
Yeah, what's the point?
Actually, any of this stuff that you can keep live and current, and by talking about it, by involving other people, just means you're getting much richer context. And
good. So a number of tips there. Rattle through a few. With impossible balances to have to be struck, keep it concise but detailed and high level.
Do we want to talk about the final section on decisions?
Well, sorry, the fourth part section of the report. Yeah. Good point.
So the fourth, once we've been through that journey of the headline, the backwards looking view, the forwards looking view, then we often put a section in to say, what decisions do I need from this board today? Yeah. So that, and it may be that you don't need any, in which case you say, I don't need any. We've got enough to work on. You can see what we're doing. But if there's something that you need to recruit somebody, or need some cash, or you've got a problem, you need some help from somebody else, or whatever it is, then it's a very good way of actually bringing that up and bringing that to the fore.
Well, that's the point to air it, isn't it? That's the place to bring it up. And I would almost refine that or go a bit further to say, don't only consider raising things that you would wholeheartedly propose. Okay, that's what people think. I've got to really believe it myself, and I'm going to persuade the others around the table that, give me the budget for another person on my team, or allow, or whatever. But sometimes almost use it as a discussion device to say, I'm not proposing this, but other people around the table maybe think I should. Do you think I should have another person on my team to help, whatever it is, to achieve that thing? Or it's another device I've used at companies when they were all saying, everything's going okay, yes, no problem, we're a bit behind target, but And I'd say, well, if I gave you £1 million to spend by the end of the financial year, what would you spend it on? Yeah. What's the first thing you can do? And it actually makes people more uncomfortable than you'd think it would, because surely the thought experiment of having £1 million is a pleasant thing. But actually it creates quite a lot of stress in people, saying, oh my goodness, I better get the right answer. Or what would I do? And actually, if people haven't thought about that, well, how are you stretching yourself then? How are you making sure that you know what the next priority is, and if only you had the resource? So back to this decision-making bit, don't just say, I've been thinking for a long time and I need approval to, sign off this CapEx or recruit this person or cut this product line or whatever it may be. But just say, look, I've been telling you for the last few months that this is under target. My diagnosis of that problem is X, and there's really only one way of fixing that. It's fairly unpalatable that we do Y. Yeah, brought the prices up by 20%, or get rid of this very needy customer, or whatever. I don't necessarily think we should, but I wanted to air it today. What does everybody else think? And they may all say, yeah, we agree with you. Let's not do that. Or actually, you have a point there. It's going to be uncomfortable to go through that process, but maybe you should. What the pros and cons. So,
and it's important to note as well that if you're taking minutes in a board meeting and you're talking about decisions, you've got to make sure you record those decisions properly.
And the reason why you took that decision.
And the reasons why you took it.
And that is not just good practice, that's your legal responsibility.
Indeed.
Record all decisions taken by directors and keep them for 10 years. Companies Act 2006. So yeah, there you go. That's a reminder of what we talked about a couple of weeks ago. So that's the 4 sections of an ideal board report. Bit of a headline to capture the attention, start telling the story, backward-looking bit, forward-looking bit, and then what do we need to discuss? Don't read it out in front of everybody, bedtime stories, circulate it in advance, check with your team if there's anything they want to put into it. Have some extra detail to refer to for questions, prepare for that, and tell a darn good yarn. Keep people's attention all the way through. Almost make them want to applaud at the end of your report. It's a fantastic report. Well done. Good.
There you go.
Thank you very much. And thank you to Matt for suggesting the subject.
Yep.
There you go. All your colleagues are going to have to come up with a subject for our podcast now as well, aren't they? Share it with everybody. Well, thanks again, everybody, for making it through another one of our SME Growth Podcast episodes from Wellmeadow, where every week we try to come up with something useful or interesting for the owners and managers of small and medium-sized enterprises. Please tell your friends that we're here, that we're doing this stuff, and hopefully you're finding it interesting, and they may do so too. Follow it on various podcast platforms, send someone an email, or let them know in the pub. And in the meantime, good luck with your business.